16 years after her husband and young daughter mysteriously vanished from a motel room during a road trip, a grieving mother's private investigation is reignited when her husband's car is found crushed in a junkyard. Her search for answers pits her against a seemingly helpful junkyard technician who knows more than he's saying, a man who is hiding a horrifying secret about what truly happened that night. The ring of the telephone was a violent intrusion, a shrill tear in the fabric of the quiet afternoon. Eleanor Vance flinched, her hand freezing over the kitchen sink. For a moment, she didn't move. No one called on October 16th. It was a day sealed off from the rest of the year, a private anniversary of loss that friends and family had long ago learned to respect with silence. The house was a quiet tomb, and the sound was a desecration. The second ring was more insistent, echoing off the linoleum floor. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She wiped her damp hands on her jeans, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs, and crossed the room. She lifted the receiver on the fourth ring. "Hello? Am I speaking with Mrs. Eleanor Vance?" The voice was male, a deep baritone she didn't recognize. It held a calm, professional authority that immediately set her teeth on edge. "This is she. Mrs. Vance, my name is Detective Miller. I'm with the San Marcos Police Department." San Marcos. The name alone was a punch to the gut. The last place. The last blurry gas station sighting on a hot night 16 years ago. Before the silence, before the world had simply swallowed her husband, Leo, and their 8-year-old daughter, Clara, whole. "I know today is a difficult day, ma'am." The detective's voice softened, and the rote sympathy in it was almost worse than the silence. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there has been a development in your husband's case." The word hung in the air between them. Development. A word she hadn't heard from law enforcement in more than a decade. A word that belonged to active cases, to stories with endings, not to hers. Her story was a fossil, perfectly preserved in amber. Eleanor gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles turning white. What kind of development?" "We've located your husband's vehicle," he said, and the clinical precision of his next words was what made them so brutal. A 1979 red Cadillac DeVille. The air rushed out of her lungs. The big red tomato. Leo's absurd, magnificent boat of a car, the one he polished every Sunday, the one they'd been driving when they vanished. Suddenly, 16 years collapsed into a single searing point of light. The hope she had worked so meticulously to bury, to starve of oxygen year after year, clawed its way up her throat, tasting of acid and bile. It was a physical, agonizing sensation. "Where?" she managed, her voice a strangled whisper. "It was brought into a local junkyard here in San Marcos, ma'am. Shaw's Auto Salvage. The vehicle it's not in good condition. It appears to have been partially crushed." Crushed. The word was an obscenity. It suggested a final violent end, an act of deliberate destruction. The questions she had cycled through for a decade and a half. Did they run away? Did they get lost? Were incinerated, replaced by a single terrifying certainty. This was not a disappearance. This was a crime. "Mrs. Vance, are you still there?" "Yes." The word was a puff of air. "Yes, I'm here. I want to see it." "I'd advise you bring someone with you," Detective Miller said gently. "The scene can be difficult." "I will," she promised, her mind already moving, the years of passive grief calcifying into something new, something hard and sharp. "I'll be there as soon as I can." She hung up the phone, her hand trembling. The quiet house was no longer a tomb. It was a pressure cooker. She stared at the receiver, at the coiled black cord, as if it were a venomous snake. For 16 years the central question had been a mournful, formless ghost. What happened? Now, it had a location, a name, Shaw's Auto Salvage. Instinct took over. She snatched the phone again, her fingers flying across the keypad, dialing the one number that had been her anchor in the storm. It rang once. "Eleanor?" Helen's voice, her mother. "They found it," Eleanor said, the words coming out in a rush, stripped of all emotion. "Mother, They found the car, Leo's car in San Marcos. I need you. There was a sharp intake of breath. Then, I'm on my way. Eleanor dropped the receiver into its cradle. She stood frozen for a single heartbeat, the axis of her world tilting violently on the words of a stranger. Then she moved. She grabbed her purse and keys from the hook by the door, her purpose absolute. The ghost had a shape now, a geography, and she was going to drive right into its heart. The interstate south was a ribbon of shimmering heat. Eleanor drove, her gaze fixed on the horizon, while Helen sat beside her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence in the car wasn't peaceful. It was a shared brace for impact, a tense quiet filled with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken fears. Shaw's Auto Salvage rose from the side of the highway like a metallic necropolis, a city of the dead. Rusted hulks were piled high, their broken frames and shattered windshields baking under the relentless Texas sun. The air, thick with the smell of oil and hot dust, felt hard to breathe. A uniformed officer waved them past a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, directing them toward the back of the lot. A lone police cruiser sat beside a cordoned-off area, its silent presence an official seal on their personal tragedy. And then she saw it. It was undeniably red, though the color was now a faded, bruised mockery of the vibrant cherry she remembered, Leo's Cadillac. The rear half was grotesquely compressed, the tail fins he'd loved so much twisted into a mangled snarl of metal. It looked like it had been swatted by the hand of an angry god. A sob caught in Eleanor's throat, and her hand flew to her mouth. It was real. This mangled thing was the last place her family had been together, the last place they were safe. Helen's hand found her arm, a firm, grounding pressure. A man in a rumpled suit approached them, his face etched with a professional weariness. "Mrs. Vance? Detective Miller." Eleanor could only nod, her eyes locked on the wreckage. She could still see Clara's face in the back window, her nose pressed against the glass. "The vein matches, no question," Miller said, his voice low. "Forensics is done for now. Nothing obvious inside, but the damage is extensive." He paused. "The reason we called you so quickly is because of how it got here." "Who brought it in?" Eleanor asked, her voice raspy. Miller's gaze shifted to a man standing by a small corrugated metal office, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "The owner says he has no record of it. His partner, Mr. Shaw over there, was the one on duty." The man walked over. He was in his late 20s, Eleanor guessed, with the tired eyes of someone who worked long hours in the sun. He wore a faded blue jumpsuit with the name Evan stitched in red thread over the pocket. He was the picture of an ordinary man. "Ma'am, detective," Evan Shaw said, his voice respectful. He dipped his head in a gesture of sympathy that felt rehearsed. "This is a terrible thing, just terrible." "Mr. Shaw," Eleanor said, her focus narrowing, pulling away from the wreck and fixing on him. "You saw who left it?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze skittering away from hers. "It was strange, ma'am, real strange. Happened yesterday. This older guy, he kind of looked like the man in those old pictures, you know? The ones that used to be up everywhere." He glanced at Miller, as if for confirmation. "Paid in cash, said he wanted it crushed right away, no paperwork. He seemed agitated. Before I could even get a signature, he just took off." The story was smooth. Too smooth. An older man, like Leo. He was planting a seed. The idea that Leo, after 16 years, had returned only to hire a stranger to erase this final piece of their life. It was absurd. It was an insult. "And you didn't get a license plate?" Helen asked, her voice sharp as glass. "You didn't see the car he left in?" "No, ma'am," Evan said, shaking his head a little too quickly. "It all happened too fast. I turned to get the receipt book, and when I looked back, he was gone. A lie." Eleanor felt it with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't just what he said, but what his body did. The way his eyes refused to meet hers for more than a second. The way he held his hands, not open in a gesture of helplessness, but clenched into loose fists at his sides. He was hiding something. He was a wall she had to get past. "We'll check local traffic cameras," Miller assured her, his voice pulling her from her intense focus on Evan. "See what we can find." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She looked from the crushed Cadillac, a monument to her loss, to the impassive face of Evan Shaw. The official investigation would move at its own pace, a slow grind of procedure and protocol. But her own investigation, silent, intuitive, and fueled by 16 years of suppressed rage, had just found its first target. She had arrived a grieving widow. She would leave a hunter. Detective Miller was saying something about procedure, about the county coroner, and official reports, but his voice had become a distant, meaningless hum. Eleanor's entire world had shrunk to the space between the crushed Cadillac and Evan Shaw's placid, unreadable face. The man's story was a fiction. She felt it in her bones, but it was a seamless one, a smooth surface with no handholds for proof. A frustrating, impotent anger began to bubble beneath her grief. They would leave here with nothing but a renewed sense of loss. Then she felt a slight pressure on her elbow. Helen. Her mother's face was pale, her lips tight, but her eyes were flinty, sharp, with a sudden, brilliant idea. "Eleanor," Helen breathed, her voice suddenly frail, her hand moving to clutch her chest. My inhaler. I need my inhaler." Eleanor turned, her own concern momentarily real. "Is it in the car?" "No, I think I brought my purse into the office when we first arrived," Helen rasped, leaning heavily on her. "Before we came out here. I need it now." Detective Miller turned, his professional weariness replaced by genuine concern. "Of course. Mr. Shaw, can you let the ladies back into your office?" Evan's face registered a flicker of something, annoyance, panic, before it was smoothed over again by his mask of helpfulness. "Yeah, sure. Right this way." He led them back toward the small, grimy building. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old coffee and motor oil. Helen, milking the performance for all it was worth, sank into a rickety plastic chair and began to rummage dramatically through her purse. "I just can't seem to find it. I'm sure it's in here somewhere." Her performance was the perfect distraction. It drew the eyes of Miller and Evan, giving Eleanor the cover she needed. Her gaze swept the room, not with idle curiosity, but with the sharp, desperate focus of a predator. The office was a chaotic mess of greasy ledgers, old calendars, and dusty machine parts. Her eyes scanned the shelves, cluttered with oil cans and manuals. And then she saw it. It was just a flash of color, almost completely hidden behind a stack of invoices. A small patch of familiar, faded blue. Eleanor's breath hitched. Time seemed to slow, the sounds of the room, Helen's feigned coughing, the crinkle of her purse, Evan's impatient shuffling, fading to a dull roar. She took a step, then another, her body moving on pure, chilling instinct. She reached past the stack of papers, her fingers closing around the object. She pulled it out into the light. It was a small plastic child's handbag, shaped like a clamshell. Blue, with a cheap gold plastic clasp. It was a Mattel Barbie accessory from 1984. It was Clara's, the one she'd insisted on taking on the road trip. "What?" Eleanor said, her voice low and trembling as she turned to face Evan, holding the relic out in her shaking hand. "Is this?" The mask on Evan's face didn't just crack, it shattered. For a single unguarded second, raw panic flashed in his eyes. He looked like a cornered animal. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back, clumsily reassembled. "Oh, that," he said, forcing a casual laugh that sounded like grinding gears. "That old thing? It's my daughter's. We're estranged. She must have left it here the last time she came by to visit. Kids, you know, they leave stuff everywhere." He reached for it, but Eleanor pulled it back, clutching it to her chest. His explanation was a lie, a desperate, pathetic lie. The bag was a ghost from another time. "Here," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too eager. "You can have it. A souvenir, I guess, since it looks like one your little girl had." He was trying to dismiss it, to dismiss her, to frame it as a sad coincidence. Eleanor stared at him, her heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm. Helen had gone silent, her asthma attack forgotten. Detective Miller watched the exchange, a flicker of interest finally cutting through his professional fatigue. Without another word, Eleanor turned and walked out of the office, the small blue handbag clutched in her fist. It was not a souvenir. It was not a coincidence. It was a trophy, carelessly left on a shelf by the monster who had taken it. Her suspicion was no longer a vague feeling in her gut. It was a solid plastic object, and it was screaming a truth that only she, for now, could hear. The drive back to Austin was a study in tense silence. The small blue handbag sat on the center console between Eleanor and Helen, a toxic artifact radiating an awful energy. It was impossible, and yet it was there. Evan's lie about his estranged daughter replayed in Eleanor's mind, each repetition making it sound more hollow, more desperate. "He's lying," Eleanor said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. "Of course he is," Helen replied, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "The question is, how do we prove it?" She glanced at the handbag. "That thing, it looks old. It looks like it's from her time. If we can prove that, his story about a young daughter leaving it recently falls apart completely." Helen's mind was always practical, always moving toward the next logical step. "There's an antique toy dealer on South Congress, Martha Pensky. She knows everything about this sort of thing." The shop was a quiet, dusty sanctuary, a world away from the violence of the junkyard. Bells chimed softly as they entered. The air smelled of old paper and wood polish. An elegant woman with sharp eyes and silver hair looked up from behind a glass counter. "Helen," the woman Martha said with a nod. "Eleanor, it's been a long time. I'm so sorry for your—" She trailed off, her gaze falling on Eleanor's face. "We need your help, Martha," Eleanor said, her voice steady as she stepped forward and placed the small blue handbag on the velvet mat on the counter. "Can you tell us about this?" Martha's professional curiosity took over. She put on a pair of reading glasses and picked up the object with a delicate, reverent touch. She turned it over and over in her hands, her expression intent. "Well, this is a bit of a classic," she murmured, her thumb running over the plastic shell. "It's a Mattel original, part of the 1984 Barbie on the Go accessory line. The year." Eleanor felt a jolt, as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "They only made this specific model for about 18 months, from late '83 through the end of '84, Martha continued, oblivious to the bombshell she had just dropped. "It was a limited run." Limited run. Not a common toy, not something easily mistaken for a modern knockoff. "But this is the interesting part," Martha said, leaning closer and tilting the bag under the light of her desk lamp. She pointed to the inside lip of the plastic shell with the tip of a pen. "Look here." Eleanor leaned in. She saw a small, rough patch on the otherwise smooth plastic. "The manufacturer's tag is gone," Martha explained. "Every one of these had a small heat stamp tag right there with the Mattel logo and country of origin. But on this one, it's been deliberately removed." She picked up a jeweler's loupe and peered at the spot. "Yes, you can see the scoring marks. Someone used heat to scrape it off, probably a hot knife or the tip of an iron. They wanted to remove any identifying marks." Deliberately removed, tampered with. The words echoed in the quiet shop. This wasn't just a relic, it was a piece of evidence that had been actively concealed, a trophy taken from the scene of the crime and then sanitized. Evan Shaw hadn't just lied. He was part of a cover-up that stretched back 16 years. "Thank you, Martha," Eleanor said, her voice a near whisper. She scooped the handbag off the counter, the plastic now feeling cold and sinister in her palm. They walked out of the shop and back into the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. The world seemed unnaturally sharp, every color too bright, every sound too loud. The handbag was no longer a suspicion. It was proof. It was a direct physical link between her daughter's last day and the man in the dirty blue jumpsuit. Eleanor's grief, which had been a vast, formless ocean, was now channeled into a single narrow current of ice-cold rage. Her investigation was no longer about finding out if Evan was involved. It was about finding out how. Later that night, the house felt more threatening than it ever had. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum from the refrigerator sounded like a footstep, a presence. Sleep was impossible. Eleanor sat in the dark of her living room, the small blue handbag on the coffee table in front of her, a single lamp casting long, menacing shadows across the walls. Beside it lay the wallet-sized photo of Clara she had carried for 16 years. The shrill ring of the phone made her jump, a scream catching in her throat. She stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who would be calling at this hour? With a trembling hand, she picked it up. "Hello? Mrs. Vance, it's Evan Shaw." His voice, the sound of it sent a wave of ice through her veins. Why was he calling her? I just wanted to call and see if you and your mother made it home all right," he said, his tone slick with false concern. "I know it was a rough day for you both. I can't stop thinking about it." He was fishing, probing, trying to see what she was thinking, what she was doing. He was checking to see if his story had held. "We're fine, Mr. Shaw," Eleanor said, her voice a tight, controlled wire. She had to keep him on the line. She had to learn something. "That's good. That's good to hear," he said. There was a pause. "That little bag you found, I hope it brings back some good memories, not just bad ones." "I'm looking at a photo of her right now," Eleanor said, her eyes locked on the picture on the table. She was so happy. This was it. The test. Evan let out a soft, sympathetic sigh, a sound meant to convey empathy, to build a bridge of shared humanity. And then he made his mistake. "I bet she was," he said, his voice laced with a practiced sadness. "It's a lovely picture. Such a shame about her losing those 2 front teeth, though. It gives her such a cute, gappy smile." Silence. A vast, roaring, deafening silence filled Eleanor's head. The photo on the table was small, worn. From where Evan had stood in the junkyard, from the brief glance he had taken at the photo in her hand, he could not have seen that detail. He couldn't have seen the tiny gap in his daughter's smile. It was impossible. Her mind reeled, the world tilting on a single horrifying realization. He wasn't describing the photograph. He was describing his memory of her. He had seen Clara, not a picture of her, but the real living child. He knew her smile, he knew her face. He was there. The knowledge was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The monster wasn't just a man who had lied about a car. He was a man who had known her daughter. "Mrs. Vance?" Evan's voice was suddenly hesitant, sensing the change in the silence. Eleanor slammed the phone down into its cradle, the plastic cracking from the force. Her hand was shaking so violently she had to grip it with the other. He knew. He was there. The phone call, his pathetic attempt to gauge her reaction, had just confirmed everything. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the image it formed was more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. The phone call had changed everything. The threat was no longer a shadowy possibility. It was a man named Evan Shaw who knew where she lived. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. "We have to go," Eleanor said, her voice shaking as she burst into the guest room where Helen was trying to rest. "We have to go to the police, now." "Eleanor, slow down," Helen said, sitting up, her face etched with concern. "He called Mother. He knew about her teeth. He was there." That was all Helen needed to hear. Within minutes they were in Helen's car, pulling out onto the dark, empty suburban street. Going to the police station in Austin felt safer than waiting in the house, a sitting target. They drove for 10 minutes, the city lights a distant glow against the night sky. They were on a quiet stretch of road that cut through a wooded park when the car began to sputter. "What's that?" Eleanor asked, her head snapping toward the dashboard. The engine coughed once, twice, then died completely. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into an almost total darkness, the car rolling to a silent stop on the shoulder of the road. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Helen muttered, trying the ignition again. Nothing. The engine was dead. A profound, unnatural quiet fell, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. Eleanor peered into the rearview mirror, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The road behind them was a black, empty void. "This can't be a coincidence," she whispered, the words hanging in the cold air. As if summoned by her fear, a pair of headlights appeared far behind them, growing steadily larger. A truck. It slowed as it approached, its brights pinning them in a harsh, white glare. It pulled up directly behind their car and stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side door opened. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the blinding light. Even in the glare, Eleanor recognized the man's build, his posture. It was Evan. "Stay in the car. Lock the doors," Eleanor hissed, but it was too late. Evan walked calmly to Helen's window, a friendly, disarming smile on his face. Another man, bigger and broader, got out of the passenger side of the truck and moved to cover Eleanor's door. "Looks like you ladies have some car trouble," Evan said, his voice casual, conversational, as if they were old friends who had run into each other by chance. "What are the odds?" Helen stared at him, her face a mask of cold fury. "What do you want, you son of a bitch?" Evan's smile vanished. The facade of the helpful, ordinary man dissolved, replaced by something flat and cold and dead. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, and when his hand came out, it was holding a gun. He tapped the barrel lightly against the window glass. "The game is over, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. His eyes met hers through the glass, and in them she saw the abyss she had been searching for. "Unlock the door. You and your mother are going to come with us." The friendly smile was gone, the man replaced by the monster. Evan's command was not a request. It was an order backed by the cold, black punctuation of the gun's barrel. There was no choice. The click of the door unlocking was a sound of absolute surrender. The man named Derek, a brute with a silent, menacing presence, yanked Eleanor's door open. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws, and hauled her out of the car. On the other side, Evan did the same to Helen. He paused only to snatch the small blue handbag from the front seat of Helen's car, a triumphant sneer twisting his lips. He was reclaiming his mistake. They were shoved into the back of Evan's grimy pickup truck. The cab smelled of stale cigarettes, gasoline, and old fast food. Derek squeezed in beside them, his massive frame radiating a brutish heat, the gun now resting casually on his thigh. The message was clear. Do not move. Do not speak. Evan got behind the wheel, and with a roar of the engine, the truck peeled away from the dead car, leaving them stranded in the past. The truck sped through the darkness, turning off the main road and onto a series of winding, unlit country lanes. Eleanor's mind, numb with terror, forced itself to work. She tried to track their path, to memorize the turns, but it was useless. The landscape was an anonymous blur of tangled trees and deep shadows, a place designed for secrets. This is how it happens, she thought, a cold wave of dread washing over her. This is how people disappear. One wrong turn onto a dark road, and the world just lets go of you. She risked a glance at her mother. Helen's face was a pale, stoic mask, but her eyes were alive with a furious, defiant light. They were not two victims succumbing to fear. They were two women gathering themselves for a fight, though what kind of fight they could possibly wage, Eleanor didn't know. "Where are you taking us?" Eleanor asked, her voice surprisingly steady. From the driver's seat, Evan laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You spent 16 years asking questions, Eleanor. You should have learned to leave well enough alone." He met her eyes in the rearview mirror, and the coldness there extinguished the last embers of her hope. "You wanted to know what happened. You're about to find out." After what felt like an eternity, the truck slowed, lurching as it turned off the asphalt onto a bumpy, unpaved track. Overhanging branches scraped and clawed at the truck's roof, the sound like fingernails on a coffin lid. Through the windshield, Eleanor saw it, a dilapidated two-story farmhouse standing dark and skeletal against the starry sky. A single yellow light glowed weakly from a downstairs window, a sickly beacon in the oppressive darkness. The truck shuddered to a stop. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets. It was the kind of silence that swallows screams. "Get out," Evan ordered. They were herded out of the truck and pushed toward the sagging porch of the house. The wood groaned under their feet. The front door swung open with a low, mournful creak, revealing a dark hallway and the man who held it open. This was their destination. This was the end of the line. The inside of the farmhouse was even worse than the outside. The air was thick with the smell of damp, rot, and unwashed bodies. They were shoved into a large, sparsely furnished living room where a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed cord cast harsh, yellow light on the squalor. Dust motes danced in the air like malevolent sprites. An older man stood waiting for them. He was thin and stooped, with a face so deeply etched with weary resignation he looked as if he were being crushed by the weight of the air itself. This was Silas. He held a length of heavy chain in his hands, his eyes avoiding theirs, fixed on a spot on the floor. "Chain them to the pipe," Evan commanded, tossing a pair of padlocks to Silas. Silas shuffled forward, his movements slow and reluctant. He secured the chains around Eleanor's and Helen's wrists, and then looped them around a thick iron pipe that ran along the base of the wall. The cold metal bit into Eleanor's skin. The click of the padlock snapping shut was a sound of finality. They were tethered, bound to the heart of the nightmare. Evan and Derek smirked, then turned and left the room, their footsteps echoing down the hall before a door slammed shut. They were alone with the old man. Silas stood there for a long moment, not looking at them. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Eleanor stared at him, at the profound, bottomless guilt in his eyes. He was not like the others. He was a prisoner here too, in a prison of his own making. Finally, he looked at her. His gaze was a physical weight, filled with a 16-year burden. His lips parted, and when he spoke his voice was a dry, rasping whisper, a sound scraped raw by shame. "He didn't kill her," Silas rasped, his eyes darting toward the closed door. "The boss, he never hurts the girls. Not that way." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "The girls? Plural? What are you talking about?" she whispered. "The girl," Silas repeated, his focus zeroing in on Eleanor's face. "Your girl, Clara. He didn't kill her." He took a shaky breath, the confession tearing out of him. "She's here." The words didn't register. They were an impossibility, a language she couldn't comprehend. Clara. Here. Alive. A tidal wave of emotions, disbelief, shock, a wild, savage hope crashed over her, so immense it threatened to drown her. Her mind reeled, unable to process the sheer magnitude of the revelation. Just then, the door at the far end of the room opened. A new man stepped into the light. He was not like the others. Where Evan was a thuggish brute and Silas a broken shell, this man moved with a fluid, predatory grace. He was handsome in a severe way, with intelligent, assessing eyes that radiated a chilling charisma. He was in control. This was the boss. He smiled, a slow, cruel unfolding of his lips. "Silas, you really shouldn't spoil the surprise." He walked toward Eleanor, his eyes drinking in her terror, savoring it. "You must be Eleanor. I've heard so much about you. My name is Victor." He stopped directly in front of her. "Your guard is telling the truth," Victor said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Your daughter is alive, and I must say we have taken excellent care of her. We gave her a new name, Anna, a new life. She's quite happy here." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She doesn't even remember you." And there it was, the full, horrifying, absolute truth. The central mystery of her life solved in the most monstrous way imaginable. Her daughter was not dead. She was stolen, erased. The relief of knowing she was alive was instantly poisoned by the horror of her captivity. The goal was no longer to find the truth. It was to survive, to escape, and to somehow reclaim a daughter who was now a stranger. Victor straightened up, a look of immense satisfaction on his face. He was a collector admiring his prize, enjoying the symphony of Eleanor's shattered expression. For him, this was the culmination of his work, the confrontation with the past he had so thoroughly erased. But as Victor reveled in his moment, something in Silas broke. The old man looked from Victor's triumphant face to Eleanor's raw, agonizing devastation. A flicker of defiance sparked in his defeated eyes. With a sudden, shuffling movement, he backed away toward the dark hallway. I gotta check on the generator," he mumbled, and before Victor could stop him, he slipped out of the room. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was enough. Victor let him go with an indulgent smirk, turning his attention back to Eleanor. "Now for the main event," he said, his eyes gleaming. "The family reunion." He disappeared for a moment and returned, pushing 3 young women into the room. They were all in their early 20s, all pale and thin, with the same haunted, vacant look in their eyes. They moved like sleepwalkers, their spirits long since hollowed out. "Go on, Mommy," Victor sneered, his voice dripping with sadistic glee. "After 16 years, surely you can pick out your own flesh and blood. Which one is she? Which one is your precious Clara?" Eleanor's heart seized. It was a monstrous game. She looked from one empty face to the next, searching for a ghost. The first girl had the wrong color eyes. The second was too tall. Her gaze fell on the third. The girl had familiar brown hair, a familiar shape to her face, but it was the face of a stranger, hardened by trauma. Eleanor searched desperately for a sign, a flicker of recognition. Nothing. Then she saw it. A tiny, silvery line, almost invisible, slicing through the girl's left eyebrow. A memory, sharp and vivid, cut through the fog of terror. Clara, age 5, tripping on the sidewalk, a small cut that needed 2 stitches, a scar she had kissed 100 times. "Her," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking as she lifted a shaking hand and pointed. "The one on the right, that's my daughter." The young woman didn't react, her eyes remaining empty and unfocused. Victor's smile widened. He had his confirmation. He took a step toward Eleanor, his intentions clear and predatory. "Very good. Now for my rewa. Leave her alone, Victor." The shout came from the doorway. Silas stood there, his face no longer fearful, but filled with a righteous, desperate courage. Victor spun around, his face contorting with rage at the insubordination. "You old fool," he snarled, and pulled a pistol from his waistband. He fired twice. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Silas cried out, clutching his chest as he crumpled to the floor. In that same horrific instant, the world outside exploded. The sound of splintering wood as the front door was kicked in, the shattering of glass. Powerful beams from flashlights cut through the gloom, and the room was flooded with armed, uniformed police officers. "Police, drop your weapon, get down on the floor, now!" The commands were a roaring, chaotic wave. Evan and Derek, who had come running at the sound of the shots, were tackled and thrown to the ground. Victor, stunned for a fraction of a second, raised his pistol, but it was too late. An officer fired, and the gun clattered from Victor's hand as he screamed and collapsed, clutching his shoulder. It was over in seconds. The noise subsided, replaced by the crackle of radios and the tense, clipped orders of the police. An officer was unlocking Eleanor's chains, his voice a calm murmur she couldn't understand. Her ears were ringing. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Her eyes searched the room, past the prone bodies of Silas and Victor, past the officers cuffing Evan and Derek. Her gaze landed on the woman with the scar on her eyebrow, her daughter, Clara. She was huddled in the corner, staring at the chaos with wide, terrified eyes. Eleanor took a step toward her, her name a silent prayer on her lips. Clara looked back at her, and there was no recognition in her eyes. There was only the blank, uncomprehending fear of a stranger. The physical battle was over, but Eleanor knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the soul, that the real war had just begun. The world, which had been a cacophony of sirens, shouting, and gunfire, was now a sterile, humming silence. The harsh, yellow squalor of the farmhouse had been replaced by the antiseptic white of a hospital room. Hours had passed in a blur of police statements, medical examinations, and the gentle, insistent questions of doctors. Eleanor and Helen had been cleared, physically unharmed, but Eleanor felt as though she'd been flayed, every nerve exposed and screaming. A soft-spoken social worker led them to a private room at the end of a quiet corridor. "She's been sedated and examined," the woman said, her voice a gentle murmur. "Physically, she's malnourished but stable. Mentally, it's going to be a very long road, don't expect too much. She's responding to the name Anna." Then the door opened, and a nurse led her in. It was Clara, her daughter. She wore a plain blue hospital gown that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her dark hair was matted and dull. Her face was pale and gaunt, a beautiful tragic mask over the child Eleanor remembered. But it was her eyes that shattered Eleanor's heart. They were empty, vacant. They darted around the room, taking in the IV stand, the window, the door, but they slid past Eleanor and Helen as if they were part of the furniture. There was no recognition, no glimmer of memory. "Clara?" Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. The young woman flinched at the name, a small, scared animal recoiling from a sudden sound. She backed away slightly, her gaze skittering to the floor. Every maternal instinct screamed at Eleanor to run to her, to wrap her in her arms and hold her until the 16 stolen years dissolved. But she knew, with a certainty that was its own form of agony, that such an act would be a violation. To this stranger, this damaged young woman who was her daughter, she was not a rescuer. She was one of the people from the terrible house, from the place of pain. Helen, ever the anchor, placed a restraining hand on Eleanor's arm. "Easy, Eleanor. One step at a time." Eleanor stood frozen, a chasm 10 feet wide separating her from her child. She had fought for this moment, had clung to a phantom hope for 16 years, had walked through fire in the last 24 hours to get here. She had found her daughter. But as she looked at the terrified stranger cowering by the door, she realized with devastating clarity that the rescue was not over. The farmhouse had been the easy part. The true rescue, the slow, painful excavation of the little girl buried under 16 years of trauma, had only just begun. The joy of finding her was completely eclipsed by the profound, sorrowful weight of what had been lost. Later, they sat in a small, windowless family conference room, the air stale with the smell of old coffee. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Detective Miller entered, looking just as tired as they felt, but with a grim sense of resolution in his eyes. He sat down opposite them, placing a thin file on the table. "We've been interviewing Evan Shaw," he began, his voice low and factual. "With what Silas has already told us, we have a clear picture. I know you deserve to have the full story." Eleanor braced herself, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. 16 years ago, Miller said, looking directly at Eleanor, Victor Nash and his 10-year-old nephew, Evan, were hitchhiking just outside San Marcos. Your husband, Leo, stopped for them. According to Evan, Victor was charismatic, charming. Leo invited them back to their motel for a meal, offered to let them stay the night before he drove them further in the morning. Leo, his kindness, his open, trusting heart. It was what had gotten him killed. That night, after Clara was asleep, Victor murdered your husband in the room. Evan. Evan was a child, but he was terrified of his uncle. He helped him. They wrapped your husband's body in a blanket and drove out to the limestone quarries west of here. They disposed of the body where it would never be found. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. She closed her eyes, the clinical recitation of the horror a series of physical blows. Then they took Clara, Miller continued, his voice heavy. Victor was already wanted for other crimes. This was his pattern, creating these twisted little families. He raised Clara as his own, alongside the other girls he'd kidnapped over the years. Evan grew up, complicit, trapped by his loyalty and fear. Silas, Evan's father, knew about it. He wasn't part of the original crime, but he lived with the guilt of it for years, as much a prisoner of Victor as anyone. Silas, Helen asked, her voice quiet. He's out of surgery, Miller confirmed. He was shot twice, but he'll live. His 911 call saved your lives. Without him, we never would have found you in time." A small, complicated flicker of grace in the darkness. "The car was the loose end," Miller concluded, tapping the file. "It had been hidden in a barn on a property Silas owns for 16 years. Victor was getting paranoid, wanted every last trace erased. He ordered Evan to take it to the junkyard and have it destroyed. That was his mistake. It brought us back into the game." He pushed the file forward. "Victor Nash, Evan Shaw, Derek, they'll all be charged. They will never see the outside of a prison again. I promise you that." He stood up, his job done. The facts were delivered, the mystery solved. The file contained all the answers to the questions that had haunted Eleanor for half her life. But as the detective left them alone in the sterile, quiet room, Eleanor knew that the answers provided no comfort. They were just a blueprint of the abyss, a detailed map of the hell her family had fallen into. The next day, Eleanor sat by her daughter's hospital bed. Helen sat in a chair by the window, a silent, watchful guardian. They had learned to be quiet, to be still. They had learned that their presence was, for now, all they could offer. Clara, the doctors and nurses were now calling her Clara at Eleanor's insistence, lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, her body rigid, her mind 1,000 miles away. Eleanor didn't try to talk. She didn't try to touch her. She just sat, and after a while she began to hum. It was a half-conscious act, a melody that bubbled up from the deep well of her memory. A simple, tuneless lullaby she used to hum to Clara every night as she drifted off to sleep. She hummed it quietly, not for Clara but for herself, for the memory of the child she had lost. She hummed the simple tune over and over, a soft, continuous thread of sound in the quiet room. And then something happened. The rigid line of Clara's body softened, her head turned on the pillow just a fraction of an inch toward the sound. Her vacant eyes seemed to focus for the first time on Eleanor's face. There was a flicker of something in their depths. Not memory, not recognition, but a question, a nascent curiosity. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She stopped humming. The silence that fell was different. It was not empty. It was filled with a fragile, terrifying potential. They looked at each other for a long, unblinking moment. Mother and daughter, two strangers, separated by a lifetime of pain, connected by a forgotten melody. Then Clara's lips parted. A small, dry, rustling sound came out, the first sound Eleanor had heard her make. It was a single whispered word, fragile as a spider's web, but it was a bridge across the abyss. "Mommy." Tears, hot and silent, streamed down Eleanor's face. It was not the joyous reunion she had once dreamed of, but something far more precious, more profound. It was a beginning, a possibility. She slowly, cautiously, reached out and laid her hand over her daughter's on the crisp white sheet. Clara didn't pull away. The road ahead was immense, a vast uncharted territory of therapy and patience and pain. There were no guarantees, but here, in the quiet of the hospital room, with her mother's hand over hers, Clara had taken the first tentative step out of the darkness. And Eleanor, no longer just a griever or a hunter, but a mother once more, would be there to walk with her every step of the way.